Hey everybody, it's Dave Eisenberg here. I'm the director of production here at ITVS. I want to welcome you to Basic Budgeting here in advance of Open Call 2017 Round 2. As a director of production, I'm going to be sort of walking you guys through some of our guidelines and talking a little bit about basic budgeting in preparation for our upcoming deadline. Just so you guys know who I am, I run the production department here. The group of supervising producers who work on our funded shows. In addition to that, I have a long career as a producer, associate producer and editor for cable documentaries before I came here. So I've definitely been in your place and in your shoes, and I know what it's like to have a bunch of concerns and questions about putting together a budget in a new format. So it's kind of what we're going to go over today. What I'd like you to take away from this presentation is a sense of what are the actual budgets that are going to be necessary for you to fill out for your open call application. We're going to talk a little bit about some important guidelines that are going to help you put those budgets together and make sure that they are put together well and include all the costs that you are going to need to get over the finish line with your ITVS funded film. And we're also going to talk about sort of, in addition to some of the policies that you're going to need to stay aware of that are important to keep in mind when putting together a budget for ITVS, we're just going to talk about some basic budgeting principles from sort of a more general lens because really, in addition to the policy, just having good best practices and thinking through your budget well is going to be the most important thing that you can do to support your application for open call. Before we start, just a couple of things to keep in mind. We are going to be talking about Open Call, which is a publicly funded initiative, just like all of our funding initiatives here at Open Call. We're overseeing more than 100 shows currently in various stages of production, supported by money from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So what that means is that we are distributing your tax dollars. Because of that, transparency is a really important thing for us. Being able to point to whoever might ask, to exactly where all that money is going, and making sure that it's being spent well. But the other thing really that we're expected to be with this money is efficient, and that is not just a goal that we have. It should be, as an independent filmmaker, something that you have in the front of your mind all the time. Efficiency is the best way to make sure that the limited money that you're going to be working with, it's never enough for your independently funded film, is going to carry you as far as possible and allow you to put the most quality up on the screen that you can. So when we're talking about transparency and efficiency, we're not just talking about best practices for protecting public money. We're really talking about something that is a tool that is a great thing for all independent filmmakers to have in their kit. And of course, efficiency starts with a well-constructed budget. Before we get into sort of the fundamentals of pulling your budget together, let's talk about a couple of policies that are specific to ITVS. These are very important, so that's why we put them up at the top of the session here. And then after that, we'll go into sort of more of the nuts and bolts. But first things first, as we say, ITVS money distributed through Open Call or any of our other initiatives is not a grant. Unlike some other funders that you may be working with, this is a production license fee. We are giving you a certain amount of production funding, and in exchange, we are expecting a certain set of rights back from you. We'll go over these later in this presentation in more detail. But the most important thing is that the U.S. public television rights, or the U.S. TV broadcast rights for your film, need to be available. If they're not, if you're already working with a U.S. television distributor, this is probably something that's good for you to find out now, because you probably don't want to go through the chore of putting together that entire application. We do need to be able to put your film on television. That's what we're funding. Your funding through ITVS starts a long-term relationship with us. In addition to financial reporting that you'll be needing to do to us as you go through the production process on a very regular basis, We do take a revenue share in your film. That is something that is part of our contractual relationship with you. And because of that, you'll need to do ancillary income reporting. So reporting on reporting on revenue generated by all distributions of the film in all markets for a period of time after the show broadcasts on public television, which means you're going to enter into at least a 15-year relationship, or you'll be entering into a 15-year relationship with us beyond the point that we are co-producers of your film. So anyway, we'll go over those in a little bit more depth later in terms of how they impact your budget, but things to keep in mind up front. The other things you should sort of note about what our expectations are of your open call budget. First, we're expecting you to put together a completion budget for your film. That means you're going to have very limited opportunities for further revision once you finish submitting your application budget. So the budget that you're putting together now should be one that you are comfortable using. So do some soul searching for the entire length of your production. So this is what you're putting on paper now is really going to be your production budget. So treat it as such. Our license fee to you when we eventually greenlight your film is going to be based on the numbers that you provide us in this budget. So it's really important for you to make sure that it includes the right costs and that it's well researched. So what are the right costs? We're going to be contracting with you around a television version of your project. So the cost for your television version, the television version of your project only should be included. So if you are proposing a 60-minute film for television, but you plan on having sort of a 90-minute festival version somewhere, the extended production costs and post costs that are necessary to put that extended version together are not going to be included in this budget, but should be tracked separately, and they won't be supported by ITVS funds. No cost of marketing, outreach, or fundraising should be included in this budget going forward. And we expect this budget that you're putting together now, since it's going to be a completion budget, to be well researched and accurate. So I would suggest you guys go out now and get quotes while you're putting it together from the potential vendors that you might use. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But this is the time to research your budget. I can't emphasize that enough. Certainly is not going to be, it's not going to serve you guys well to sort of put in estimates now, and then when it comes time to greenlight your film, say, oh, I've got to double check my work. We're expecting that your work is double checked by the time that you make it through the open call process. All right. So moving on, a couple final important things to keep in mind before we get into putting the budget together. We do not allow deferred expenses of any kind in ITVS budgets, meaning expenses related to work that has already been conducted but not paid for yet. All these past costs must be paid with actual cash, and you need to have backup to support the fact that these past expenses have been paid. And that includes your producer salary. When you put in a salary line for yourself in this budget, please note that it's going to be for the work going forward. Any deferred compensation for work prior to ITVS coming on board is not going to be allowed. Also, hard costs only in these budgets, meaning no in-kind expenses, either past or projected. If you want to talk about, occasionally people will put information about in-kind services that they're being provided in the narrative portions of their open call application, just to support why the budget looks like it does. But just so you know, our guidelines, our contract with our funder prevents us from considering those in-kind expenses as having a cash value. All right. So what are the types of budgets that you're going to need to be working on here as we work through the open call application? You'll be submitting two different types of budgets. The first one is the application budget, which many of you are already working on now. This is part of the WiseHive application. It is a summary budget. So what it includes is sort of bottom line costs, both past and future, for like big chunks of your budget. different so what we call different major categories in your budget, in addition to all the secured funding that you have to work with to date. So really, this is bottom line totals and subtotals to give us an idea of the overall picture of what your film is going to cost. If you move farther through the process, if you make it through the first round of selection, we will come back to you in a number of weeks, asking you to fill out a more detailed line item budget prior to moving to the panel selection phase of our process. At that point, we will provide you with a separate Excel file that is a template that we use. You'll need to have not only line item detail for all the big categories that you're including in the application budget, but also that form will ask you for unit breakdowns for costs, and also to break down what has been spent to date and what are your expected expenses in the future. So it's a little bit more detailed. We'll go through both of these next. So those are the two budgets, though. Let's start with the application budget in the online application, our summary budget. It's got two sections, like I said. One is secured funding. What does secured funding mean? This is funding that is not funding you're hoping for, or funding that you're still in negotiations to secure, or funding that down the line you plan on applying for. This is only funding that has been granted to your film from any funding source up to this point. So this means that money is either on its way to your bank account after having a signed contract with a funder and in transit, or it's actually in your bank account or has been in your bank account. Okay, pending funds is where you'll put any of those other categories, funds that are related to applications that are already out and being considered, funds that you are hoping to apply for. We ask you to just sort of fill that in, as long as, in addition to both the expected amounts and sort of a whatever information you have about a date for when that funding might come into your film. So, but remember, secured funding is secured. It's not going to change. It's 100% already in your bank account, or just a matter of getting the check in there. Okay. The other section of your summary budget is the expenses section. This is what I was talking about before. These are, we have some suggested categories in here. If you're breaking down expenses in a slightly different way, you'll have the flexibility to sort of change these. What we want to see is the all-in totals for the different sections of your budget. So these are the bottom lines. We're not looking for a breakdown of past versus future expenses here, but we do want these estimates to be realistic, because the application is going to do something fun for you. It's going to calculate your ask to ITVS automatically. So you won't be able to actually manually enter anything into the ITVS request. The way that this number shows up is by automatically subtracting your secured funding from the total budget of the film, because we are interested in knowing what it's going to take to get your film over the finish line. Open Call is a completion funding initiative, so we are going to base, ITVS is going to base its production license fee on the expenses that you need to finish the film. So make sure that those numbers are as accurate as possible, because it will influence what your request to ITVS will be. All right. Next budget we're going to talk about is the line item budget, and really the rest of this the rest of this presentation is going to be talking about various pieces of how you put this together. But essentially, if you do make it to the later stages of production, or the later stages of Open Call selection, we are going to ask you for a budget in a format that looks very much like what you're seeing on your screen now. In addition to having a unit breakdown in it, we are going to look for you to let us know how much of each line in the budget has already been spent. And these are actuals that can be supported by the expense ledger from your film or from your production bank account, and then also what you're expecting to spend going forward, so that we can understand what that estimated total, what your bottom line is sort of telling us in terms of where you are in your production process. We're also going to ask you to identify as best you can what you're planning on ITVS helping you cover, as well as what will be covered by other funders. This just sort of helps us get a sense of how our funding is going to fit into your production budget. So, can numbers change between these two budgets? Absolutely. We do not hold it against you if you have certain numbers in your application budget at this stage, the all-in summary budget that you're putting together, and there is some variation between that and when you actually go in and put it in the line item budget. Number one, we assume that you are following our instructions to go get accurate quotes and really lock down your costs in the weeks between submitting your initial application and submitting this line item budget. And the other thing is that the actual exercise of putting together a line item budget oftentimes causes you to think really carefully about, well, geez, what am I really going to spend on my editor? Or how does this fit with my schedule? So we expect a certain amount of variation between these two. If they are apples and oranges, that could throw up a red flag for us. So it's in your best interest to really do as much of the research before submitting your actual your first application as possible. But if something creeps up or gets reallocated or shifts around within sort of a reasonable margin, it's not going to impact your application negatively. Okay. All right. So question here, just so you guys know, I'm going to be fed questions that you're entering in the OV sidebar there as we go along and fitting them in where appropriate in the presentation. I'll also do a little bit of Q&A at the end. Question about producer fee. Is there an acceptable range of producer fees? We're going to talk a little bit more about this later in the application. But no, we would never say, it's 10% of your budget or it's this many $1,000s. What we're looking for is that what you budgeted for yourself is a reasonable salary, for you as a filmmaker to do the work that you're supposed to be doing on the film going forward. And we're looking for really is that it's not deferred compensation for the entire project. Okay. All right, so we've been through it, and the question that always comes up is sort of, cool, that's all great, but how do I do it? So we're going to talk a little bit now about coming up with your budget figures, just in the context of project management and a few budgeting fundamentals. So what I always tell people when they're coming up with a budget is the best place to start is with your plan. You guys are actually putting together, or should be putting together an application based on a production plan that you already have, or that you are developing as we speak for the project. That's going to include some documents such as a script or a treatment, a production schedule, maybe a hypothetical budget that you're working with now, and then also a show Bible, which is kind of a catch-all term that I'm going to use to refer to any agreements that you already have in place or expecting to have in place that are going to limit the rights, limit what you can do with the film or how you can go about producing it. So a good example of an agreement like that would be, I don't know, a distribution agreement from another funder that says you have to have this film produced by a certain date. Or let's say you're working with a high-profile subject, and they say, well, we will only grant you access to interview this person on this date for this time, and that's the only material that you can use about the subject. These are all things you need to keep in mind because they all have impact on your budget. You're also going to be putting together your open call application where there are a lot of different pieces. So you'll be putting together a budget, you'll have a proposal, an online application, and your work sample. What we're going to be looking for when we evaluate your budget and what you should be thinking about when you put your budget together is that it's part of a system of items that are all talking to each other. We don't want to see one story told about production in your proposal that is not supported by what you have put in your budget. So, if you say we're going to be shooting this over 3 months and it'll be, 6 weeks of active shooting, that's what we're going to want to see budgeted for when we actually start reviewing your budget. We are actually, one of the things that we do to make sure as part of evaluating your application is that all these pieces look like they're talking to each other in that kind of a one-to-one way. So if there's a discrepancy, We are going to dig a little bit deeper in your application until we can figure out why things are the way they are. And if they're not, that can be a red flag. So let's talk a little bit about these pieces. When you're going, in terms of putting your budget together, when you are thinking about your treatment or proposal, you really want to be putting together something that describes your story completely. And that means it details the scenes, characters, and locations that are going to be necessary for you to do your work in putting this film together. The reason that you're going to want to get as detailed as you can in terms of where your concept of your story and how you're able to communicate it now is because really this story is your wish list of everything that you're going to need to assemble and bring together to make the film. So you know you're going to need an interview with a few characters, some interviews with a few characters. You know you're going to need coverage of a certain event. You know you're going to need a certain type of archival footage in a certain amount. So all of those things become sort of the little pieces, the building blocks of your film, and we're going to want to see in the budget how those are all paid for. The other thing you should be putting together is a detailed schedule. So this is part of your application, and we ask for it on a certain level. You know, we're asking for production benchmarks and the dates you think you're going to cross it. However, you know, you should also be thinking about how long it's going to take to complete each of these steps and what the little pieces of work that are going to go into, say, putting together a rough cut are. In order to get your rough cut together, you're going to need to go on a certain number of production trips, which are each going to have a schedule of their own, which is made up of days. So getting down to that level and knowing how long each, not only the big chunks of work that you're going to need to do to cross the finish line are going to take, but each of the little subunits that make up those big chunks of work are going to help you come up. That's the data that you're going to need to put a budget together. And finally, like I said, your show Bible. Think about all the agreements and promises that you've made to people up to this point, or the ones you can anticipate needing to make prior to getting across the finish line, because those are all going to have potentially impact on your process. And sometimes even the working these things out can impact your budget. If you know you're going to be working with high-profile characters or archival materials that are being held very closely, you're probably going to need to factor that into maybe travel, research, and legal costs. So all these things that go on behind the scenes and not on screen can also have impacts on your budget as well. So if you take nothing else away from this section, know that we are really looking at your budget not in isolation. Like, is this a good budget? We're looking at your budget as part of a larger system of a larger plan that you are presenting to us in the context of this application. So if each of the items in your application, each of these little pieces of your application is telling a different story, you're not going to be making as strong a case for your film as a plan that appears unified and informed by the same assumptions. Okay. I've been being fed some questions here. We are definitely going to get to some of these as we move forward. I'm going to try to answer questions, though, in the context of the section of the presentation that where it makes sense. So if you ask a question I haven't gotten to it yet, please just stand by. I may actually be covering it as we move forward through the presentation. All right. So once you have your plan in place, putting together your budget, the next thing you need to do is really just do your homework. And this is what I sort of was calling out earlier. Once you know what it is that you need to make your film happen, you are going to need to actually go out and ask people how much that stuff costs. The nice thing is that we're living in a time where all that information is very accessible. So, I mean, obviously, if you have a post house in mind, now is the time to start talking to them a little bit about the broad strokes of your plan, or a very detailed plan that you've put together, and get their sort of idea of what it might cost to get that film once you've offlined it onto like master tape. If you're thinking about specific crew members and bringing them onto your team, go ahead and audition them. Ask them, a little bit of information about their rate. Ask if, they would be able to work with you on the price at this point. Let them know kind of what your expectations of them are, and they can tell you what they think it's going to cost. This is where specificity is really important. If you don't have a clear idea of what you want to do with your film at this point, or you're still sort of figuring it out, that's fine, but being able to communicate with a degree of clarity, both to us as people who are going to be reviewing your film as potential funders, but also to people who might be working on it, is the best way and really the only way for you to start figuring out what the film is actually going to cost. Because this is the piece of it that's not in your control. What things are going to cost or what things are going to cost. And that's all information that you need to know and be very clear about if you're going to be making projections about how those costs fit into an overall plan of your film. All right. So once you figure out how much everything is, like in terms of a rate or in terms of like a quote, then figuring out your budget based on that is actually fairly straightforward. The number of units times the cost, which you just researched, times the amount of time that cost is going to be incurred over, will yield how much you should budget for any individual item. And so, for crew or people that are coming onto your film on a day rate, that's really going to be the number of days plus the number of travel days based on the rates that they gave you. For an online edit, like a color correct or a sound mix, that might be like a lump sum, but it's based on sort of a breakdown, a detailed quote, or sort of an itemized estimate that that provider has given to you based on what you've told them about your film. So you just start really going line by line, plugging this stuff in and making sure that the assumptions that you're using in terms of how long you're going to need everybody for, and when they're going to be needed, is informed by a well thought out plan, your schedule and your treatment. And that's it. You got a budget, right? Well, not really. I mean, I know we're going to keep talking about this for quite some time, for a little bit longer here today. There are some tips and tricks that make navigating this stuff, obviously a little bit more complicated. But really, one of the things I always pause in this presentation to just sort of call out here is that people get intimidated by budgets and their financial reporting because they have these things in their mind like, oh, I just don't know like what everything costs, or I can't figure out what things cost, or I can't do the math, or I really don't even know what I want. And like all that stuff is not as true as you think it is. The costs for everything are figure outable. I mean, it's investigatable. Like you can actually get people on the phone and they can give you rates to base estimates on. The math that you need to do this kind of work is really stuff that you learn in junior high school, and if you have a calculator or a cell phone, is not outside of your grasp. The real thing where people get stuck, and what I always push people to do, is to sort of own, is that they don't have specificity in terms of what their vision for the film is yet at this point. And if you don't, then yes, it is very, very hard to, if you don't know what story you're going to tell and you can't see it in your mind, it becomes very, very hard to put together a wish list of things that you're going to need to actually go out and secure to make the film happen. Does that mean that right now you need to know exactly what your film is going to look like down to the frame? No. Obviously that stuff changes, and the story that you start out wanting to tell is not often the story you end up telling. But being able to, at least based on what you know, game out a scenario for producing the film that you can envision from beginning to end is a real mark of directorial authority. It looks real great in terms of how it shows up in the other parts of your application, and it's absolutely essential to begin putting together a list of items that you think, a list of costs that you think are going to be necessary to cover if you're going to put this film together. Okay, so budget research tips and tricks. Obviously, it's not quite as easy as all that. What I always tell people to do as they're putting together a budget is to ask themselves a few questions. Um, you know, in terms of distribution, who am I committed to delivering to? And if I don't know yet, who do I want to be working with, and what sorts of rights are they going to take? Also, what format do I plan on shooting in? What other formats am I going to incorporate if it's an archival type film? And what am I going to need to deliver in for each of these ideal broadcasters? The reason I say that you should ask these questions to yourself is because the two areas where people most consistently get into trouble in these budgets are in terms of rights and post costs. And it's a little bit ironic because these are the ones that actually, if you can put together some assumptions about where you want to distribute the film and what formats that are going to be involved in putting the film together, you can actually get pretty solid quotes for these. But it does involve doing the research ahead of time. So really know like what markets, in terms of figuring out rights, you should start to get a sense now of what markets you think you're going to need to clear for, and think about sort of your rollout strategy for the film in an ideal world. Are you going to want to go to festivals first and then see what happens and hopefully use that money to pay for your additional clearances? Public television, if you're applying to us, you're definitely going to need to figure out what it's going to cost to distribute or to secure the rights that we need. But think about your plan in terms of sort of a wider lens, because oftentimes you can get a better deal if you are clearing for a bunch of markets all at once as opposed to going back piecemeal. And then as far as like format conversions, really being familiar with the tech specs for potential broadcasters, especially with public television, can be key to getting a quote for post work that really makes sense. So for ITVS, the answers to all these questions are up on your screen. We are going to be, you need to plan in our budget on clearing things for 4 years for U.S. broadcast television. We do take a limited streaming window after public television distribution. This is a place where it's a little bit squishy, depending on the broadcaster you end up going with, because we work with broadcasters across public television. Maybe just a few days you need to clear for, like 7 or 14, I think is the floor right now with most broadcasters. It could be all the way up to 30, 60, or 90. So yeah, having a sense of who those broadcasters are and what they require is important. For now, sort of using 21 to 30 days as a baseline is a good way to get in the ballpark. We do require that you clear everything for broadcast promotion for the entire license period. And then we do take an institutional promotional right, which means that we can use excerpts from your film to promote ITVS for basically ever. So you need to make sure that people you're negotiating with are aware of this set of rights. As far as delivery, this is a very generic public television delivery that's up here on the screen, but it covers basically what you'll need to sort of deliver to most broadcasters. HDCam masters. HDCam is still the preferred delivery format. We do require you provide a texted and textless version of the film when you deliver. Audio stems are required by most broadcasters now. In addition, we may ask for like a separate reel of just the cleared materials if you're working with a lot of archival, to make sure that we're not pulling anything out of the film that can't be used for promotion. We do require a trailer, and we need you to hit the PBS technical operating specifications, which are available on PBS's website. And really, that's a good thing if you're going to go in and get a quote from a post house. It's really great to be able to put those specs out in front of them, because they are a bit stiffer, more stringent than many broadcasters out there, so that they get a sense of what they should be quoting you for. All right, so let me stop here. We have a couple of questions here. So there's a question about music licensing costs. I think the best way to start approaching costs for a composer or a rights holder, or if you're looking for like a some published music that's already out there. The hardest part of of negotiating rights for a particular song may be actually finding out who owns it. Those people should make themselves make themselves known, because there's a huge sort of secondary market for licensing music out there, especially for film and television. A lot of times though, especially for older music, that license has changed hands so many times that you can't just actually pick up the record, find out who the label is, and then just call them up. So that can be a little bit of digging. That can take a little bit of digging. I think that if you are going to be using a lot of already published music, one of the things that you might want to factor into your budget, and one of the things that I really suggest doing, is getting in touch with an archival researcher. There are people out there who do this work professionally, and this is all they do is try to figure out which archival materials are owned and available in which collections. And if you're looking for a particular particular song, or something especially that's been published a long time ago, those are the sorts of people that can make that process a lot easier and cheaper for you, as opposed to you working on it for months or years and getting nowhere. All right, other things not to forget in terms of your budget. These are some other items that are frequently overlooked. Obviously, you need to get you're running your own small business, and you're required to carry certain insurances. Errors and omissions insurance is something that we require of all of our funded productions. These policies protect you and us if there are factual inaccuracies or other research oversights. As you're, it might not even be your fault. I mean, if a source that you are quoting has made an inaccurate claim, sometimes you could end up wrapped up in a lawsuit there. E&O covers you in this highly litigious world if any of those circumstances occur. Another thing that people often sort of take for granted is how much it's going to cost for legal. Especially nowadays, legal costs can actually end up being a big chunk of your budget. Not only are you negotiating distribution deals and rights deals with a bunch of third parties that are out there, but a lot of people are increasingly deciding that they want to make a fair use argument to use certain archival materials. We don't necessarily discourage people from doing that, but one thing that people don't think about, filmmakers don't think about, is that fair use argument, or claiming some fair use for using third-party materials, is not free. You may not have to pay as much in terms of licensing the actual materials that you are claiming fair use for. You will end up making up some of that, though, in legal fees, because most insurers require a lawyer to provide a fair use letter to support a claim of fair use. And we do need to make sure that none of that material is excluded from your errors and omissions policy. The other thing that people don't think about is press materials. The time to collect press materials when you're putting together a documentary is while you're in production, not after everything has wrapped. So budgeting to have a professional photographer to take some high quality stills that will be suitable for future press, including print, not just on online use, is really essential. Don't count on using screen grabs from your films. A lot of times it's difficult to get the resolution that's necessary to really effectively use frame grabs in all the promotional uses that you might want out there, especially for posters, and if you get some actual printed press in a magazine or a newspaper. Having a good set of high quality both production stills and promotional photos from the shoot of your film you'll end up being really happy you have those. And finally, don't forget your salary. There's been a couple of questions about this, so hopefully when I talk about this, I'll get to those questions. But essentially, the way we look at salary is that your time and focus deserve compensation. we want to make sure that for the amount of time that you are budgeting for the public television production of this film, the cost going forward, that you are budgeting enough for yourself to support your living, to like be in line with salaries in your market and with the experience that you bring to the film, and that it's enough to secure your time and attention and focus for the rest of the film. If you're shorting yourself on your salary, it's actually sort of a red flag for us, because we assume that you are going to be working on other projects and potentially other having your attention divided during the time that you are going to be working on the film. And that's bad for us, because once you start getting involved with us, we are going to begin working with folks internally and externally to start figuring out a landing path for your film on public television. And a lot of times we're not working with super tight windows, but there are definitely incentives for us staying on schedule. So we want to make sure that you are setting yourself up to do that. It doesn't look bad to pay for yourself. It doesn't look bad to pay yourself. Like I said, we actually consider it a plus. However, we do consider your salary in terms of the work going forward, not deferred compensation from before. All right. So financial records. This is sort of the last section that I wanted to hit here, and it really takes what we're talking about in terms of constructing budgets forward, and I want to give you a sense of how this comes into play. Some things that you can do now to set yourself up for success when you do get selected for funding from ITVS. So as you're organizing your budget now, it's really important to settle on a chart of accounts, which means an order of things in the budget that you're okay sticking with for the rest of the production. So right here, we see a blow up of a subcategory of a line item budget. So within crew and personnel, we have a bunch of different costs listed here, about 11 costs. Each of these sort of earmarked to pay for a certain person's salary that you're anticipating bringing on over the course of the film. This is a good order. If you do make it to the panel phase, you're going to see that we have inserted a chart of accounts into our template budget. We don't require you use that chart of accounts. What we need is for the way you organize things in the budget to correspond to the general ledger of expenses, the financial records that you are producing for the film. So if you have things organized in a slightly different way than what we're putting forward on paper, go ahead and use that. That's fine. We just want to make sure that everything is accounted for, that the order that you're using makes sense and is like easily comparable on a sort of a one-to-one basis with the ledger that you're using to back up the budget, and that it doesn't change over the course of production. That's really important for us. We want to see that consistency so that we can make sure that we're helping you keep track of where you are in your budget. So that general ledger is another item that we are going to have you give to us when you do financial reporting going forward. And then also if you make it to contracting with ITVS, we'll need to see one of these to back up the spent to date expenses, the actuals, in your contract budget. Things to note about ITVS's accounting requirements. We do require a certain level of detail because at the top I talked about transparency. It's really important that certain things be included in all of your ledger entries. Want to make sure that the date of each transaction is clearly labeled here. The payee who actually received the money is necessary. For each expense, we want to see a detailed memo that gives information about what the expense was for and why it was necessary in certain cases, and then also the amount of each transaction. So this is the level of financial reporting or level of financial records that we are going to need to review in order to approve your contract budget. So it's really important that you begin to sort of assemble this backup for everything that you're going to say is spent to date in your contract budget moving forward. There's a question here about bookkeeping requirements for ITVS being somewhat rigorous. We don't suggest a certain percentage of your budget be devoted to bookkeeping. What we do expect you to do is to budget for a professional bookkeeper. And that may mean you getting in touch with somebody right now to sort of go over what our requirements are in broad strokes, and seeing if they can give you a rate and an estimate of weeks per or hours per week that might be necessary to get those records together. Yeah, I mean, when you do move to the contracting phase, when you move forward with your relationship with ITVS, we are going to require that you work with a bookkeeper. Although a lot of producers who are good with this stuff do a lot of the day-to-day data entry themselves. Usually we suggest to most people working with a bookkeeper to sort of clean things up before you report to us, and then also before we close the film. Right. So the general ledger contains, actually I'll go back to the slide. The general ledger contains information. It's basically just sort of an index of something else that we're expecting you to have, which is really detailed records for all of the expenses that have gone into making your film happen. And then also we'll expect you to keep sort of that same level of detailed records about expenses moving forward once you start spending ITVS's money. A few examples of these are on screen, the types of things that we'll need you to collect, and we expect them to be organized. Basically, we'll go through, as we do financial reporting with you, once you get greenlit, we'll go through and pull a few of these just to make sure that as sort of a spot check to make sure that things are being properly collected on your end. But there's another reason for this beyond transparency, especially right now when you guys are potentially spending money out of your own pockets. Every cent that you're spending on this film is equity in your film that you are buying out of your own pocket. So that means that every cup of coffee on your production trips or your scout trips, every hotel room when you are going to some library to research archival material, the associate producer that you have brought in on a couple of days just to log your tapes, all of that stuff, if you are paying for it out of pocket right now, is an investment that you are making in your film, especially if it's not supported by any outside funding. So both as a matter of good business practices, but also as a matter of protecting your own equity in your film, we really ask you to be meticulous in terms of record keeping. Basically, if you don't have a record of something, you haven't spent it. And that can be a real bummer, considering a few other ITVS policies that will come into play if you are greenlit by ITVS for funding. One is deficit recoupment. We do allow for limited recoupment of prior out-of-pocket expenses. We do have a revenue share with you, but we allow you to deduct a certain amount to offset out-of-pocket expenses incurred prior to contracting with ITVS. We'll go over sort of how that procedure works when you actually get greenlit. It's not for everything, but a huge chunk of things, most of what you're spending money on right now will actually fall in that category, and it's a good way to sort of get some of that money back before having to share it with ITVS. And again, there is a revenue share calculation that comes into play, and if you have spent money in your film prior to ITVS coming on board, you've actually contributed a certain dollar amount, which will offset ITVS's funding in that revenue share calculation. However, in order for that investment to be counted, you do need to have the appropriate backup. And so that is all of those things that were on that previous slide to substantiate that you actually spent money on a certain item. Finally, before we end, just a couple of other things to consider about working with ITVS around financials. We are going to require you have a separate bank account for the project. Not at this stage, if not at this stage, then before we contract with you. It makes it much simpler for us to reconcile your financial records with your production accounting. So that doesn't mean that could be expenses related to other versions. That sort of stuff doesn't need to be pulled out, but we want the film to have one bank account. Really what we want it separate from is overhead costs or costs for other films. That's really important that those don't go through the same account. You are going to need to work with a bookkeeper once you start working with ITVS. You'll need to actually, if you aren't using it already, set up an accounting software for your film like QuickBooks with the chart of accounts that you're using for the contract budget. And finally, you will need to be doing ongoing financial reporting to us where all this stuff comes into play. So just be prepared for that and set yourself up for success when you're setting up your budget now. Because again, when you put together that line item budget for us in the open call process, you're not going to have a ton of opportunity to revise that. That budget will become sort of the basis for your production budget moving forward in the lucky event that you guys get greenlit. Right? So that's it for now. We have a few minutes here. I am happy to answer specific questions. And otherwise, I have a few other things that we can go over too. It seems like I have a couple of questions here on my tablet. Okay, so a question comes up about what if you were wearing multiple hats throughout the production? How do you account for your salary? It's a really good question, and you can be well ahead of the game if you go ahead and when you are preparing this budget for your application, you go through your projected budget and actually consolidate all of your line items. So if you are doing part of the editing, part of the shooting, you'll be actually taking some of the archival researcher line maybe. Make sure all those things are grossed up into a single line for you as the applicant of the film. That's actually going to put you ahead of a lot of the budgets that we see, and that's something that we're going to require you to do prior to greenlight. But it makes it very, very clear sort of what is, it also makes it very clear what sort of substantiating if that amount is a little bit higher because you're going to be doing a lot on the film. It makes it clearer that that's sort of what's going on there. Okay, question about the timing of things. So when you are greenlit for funding from ITVS, that is the point where in most cases you can begin counting those expenses as expenses that ITVS is going to cover. So you'll get an official greenlight call from us, which will begin our contracting period and also our stage of final vetting for open call. Generally, expenses that you incur related to the production during those times, that time can be reimbursed with ITVS money when it comes in. Usually that contract negotiation phase takes anywhere from like a month and a half to 3 months. So that period there is from greenlight to actually signing the contracts. That period in there, you can potentially reimburse yourself with ITVS funds. However, one of the things that I really caution people to do is that when we give you a call, that official greenlight saying that you've been recommended for funding through open call, from that point until we sign a contract, we are each vetting one another. We are taking a deeper dive into sort of the truth of, into the details of your film. And you are actually reviewing our production agreement to figure out what it means to work with ITVS. It's a really essential period for us to sort of figure out what agreements we're going to be making with each other. And so if you, funding is not guaranteed at the point that we make that call, saying you've been recommended for funding. So if you're spending a ton of money during that period of time, you just sort of open the spigot, and you find something in our production agreement that you don't really like, or we find something about your film that we can't makes it so we can't contract with you, that ITVS money that you were counting on a reimbursement from won't come in. So just be very, very cautious. Though you can begin sort of charging expenses to ITVS at that moment of green light, we do ask people to sort of be mindful of the fact that we are going through a contract negotiation process and that funding is not guaranteed. All right. Okay, what about paying for money going to subjects? This is a really good question. So, due to the editorial standards of public television, we do not allow you to pay your subjects for interviews. This is sort of a hard and fast rule. It's part of the editorial guidelines that public broadcasters put out. Paid interviews are not allowed. However, those editorial guidelines do allow you to compensate a subject at the fair market rate for materials that they are providing to the film. So if they are, say, giving you access to a certain collection of home movie footage or certain stills that are going to support your filmmaking, you can work out a licensing deal with them as long as it's not overly generous or generous beyond market rate. And frankly, most of them, when you work them out with a subject, end up being discounted. But you're allowed to sort of compensate them for something of value that they're providing for the film. So that is okay. Paying someone to appear on camera is ethically problematic and will get you in trouble. All right. Contingency. This is sort of the last question I'm going to answer. We do not ask you to put a contingency. We do not allow for a contingency line in our budgets. Essentially, what we're looking for is a budget that includes the projected costs. What you think the actual costs are going to be. We will work with you around. Say something unexpected happens and the budget situation needs to change, and you need to sort of figure out some way to support costs that don't end up in the original budget. You'll work with us on that going forward, but what we really want to see is sort of what the actual costs of the film are going to be without sort of padding or contingency added. Okay. Questions, follow up on consolidating your salary into a single line. How do you indicate that you budgeted for those items and they're being absorbed in the producer's fee? There are a couple of narrative sections in terms of providing explanations for the budget in our application, and then also you'll have the opportunity to sort of update and provide us an update on the project when you get to the panel phase, if you go that far. I would include a narrative description of the different costs that are being absorbed into the producer's salary line, either in your initial narrative about the project or in that update that we'll ask you for, along with an updated schedule if you make it to panel. Great. One or two other things since we have time. Just a note about independent contractors versus employees. A lot of you are going to be budgeting costs for salary, assuming that the people you're going to hire for your project are independent contractors. It's just sort of what most independent filmmakers do. Just want to put a warning out there that states are starting to crack down on this pretty heavily. So it's really important that if you are going to be working with someone as an independent contractor, that you are working with them actually as an independent outside contractor for your film. So just so that we're clear on the definitions, an independent contractor is hired on a job-by-job basis. They operate as a separate business with their own insurance, their own business structure, and they offer their services to the general public. That means that you can't work with an independent contractor who is coming to your office every day and not able to work for anyone else, unless you have an agreement that is for a very specific period of time, and that person is being compensated. That is a term of their contract to you. If you just have an informal agreement with, say, somebody right out of college, that they're just going to show up every day and you're going to pay them like a salary every 2 weeks, but they're not a contractor at that point. They become an employee because you have the right really to control the means by which they do their work, and there is an expectation that they are working for you exclusively. Really the best way is to protect yourself in terms of setting up a contractor versus employee relationship is to have an independent contractor agreement with each of your independent contractors that clearly defines the scope of the work that they are going to that they are being contracted to fulfill. So 3 shoots of 5 days each on these dates, things like that. That's the best way to protect yourself. Just keep in mind too that if you are hiring contractors, you are responsible for issuing them a 1099 form summarizing their payments because they are in charge of withholding their own taxes. For employees, it's much more complicated. Some of you may already have employees and you know this, but basically you need to issue W-2s and you may be responsible to withhold a ton of different employer taxes or employment taxes from their wages every year on your end. So make sure that if you have any questions, this is something that I would highly suggest you consult with a production attorney about to make sure that you are complying with local law, just because this is an area where filmmakers can get themselves into trouble, especially if where it usually comes up is if somebody who you have been treating as a contractor makes an unemployment claim. That's usually the bell that gets rung that causes people to start looking into what the nature of their employment with you was. So usually if you've let somebody go, not always, but sometimes it's not under the best of circumstances. So that could be a very difficult situation for you guys. So be careful. The other thing is people often have questions about fiscal agents and sponsors. It is fine if you have a fiscal sponsor for your project. A lot of times you need to set up this relationship in order to get funding from some of the, especially humanities councils across the country. Just so you know, we do not require you to have a fiscal sponsor to work with ITVS, and we are most likely going to ask you to accept our funding directly as opposed to running it through a fiscal sponsor. Occasionally, you can't avoid doing it. There's some relationship with your fiscal sponsor that prevents it. We can talk about that down the road in terms of what the implications are. Generally, though, we're going to be expecting that fiscal sponsor to be providing some sort of valuable service to the production in exchange for their fee or the amount that they withhold from our funding. And if they're not, it could be an issue. So just keep that in mind. All right. Can we share an independent contractor contract? We have some templates that we provide to filmmakers who are working with ITVS who are greenlit for funding. We do not have an independent contractor template that we share to the general public for a variety of reasons. However, most attorneys who work in this business tend to have templates that they've used over and over. Your attorney may have an independent contractor agreement that's already pre-drawn up that they may be able to give you access to. But yeah, we don't offer them to the general public. All right. Great. We are going to start wrapping things up here. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. Just so you know, after a few days, keep tuned into our website. We are most likely going to make this presentation available to the public as we have in the past. So anybody who missed it, tell them to keep an eye on our website, and we will let people know how to access it. Also, if you have any questions whatsoever about budgeting or putting together a budget for ITVS, your ITVS application, my email is there on the screen. Feel free to use it at any time. Really happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you guys for tuning in. It's been a pleasure, and best of luck with your open call application. Really looking forward to seeing all of your projects come through the next round.